The Road to the Greatest Disaster of Renaissance Rome, May 5th, 1527. For centuries, Rome had stood as the heart of Christianity and one of the richest cities in Europe. Its magnificent churches, grand palaces, priceless works of art, and vast treasures attracted pilgrims, scholars, and merchants from across the continent. But behind the city's beauty, Europe was falling into chaos. Two of the most powerful rulers in the world were locked in a bitter struggle for dominance. On one side stood the ambitious Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. On the other was King Francis I of France. Their rivalry had turned Italy into a battlefield where kingdoms changed hands, cities burned, and alliances shifted almost overnight. Caught between these giants was Pope Clement VII. The Pope feared that Emperor Charles V was becoming too powerful. If the emperor gained complete control over Italy, even the papacy itself could lose its independence. Hoping to stop this growing influence, the Pope joined an alliance known as the League of Cognac, bringing together France, Venice, Florence, and several Italian states against the emperor. It was a decision that would have devastating consequences. In northern Italy, Charles V's imperial army had just finished months of brutal campaigning. The soldiers had fought tirelessly through harsh weather, deadly battles, hunger, and disease. Yet, despite their victories, they had received almost none of the wages they had been promised. Month after month, payment never arrived. Food became scarce, morale collapsed, anger spread through the ranks. Many soldiers openly threatened mutiny, insisting they would no longer fight for empty promises. Among them were experienced Spanish veterans, disciplined German Landsknechts, and hardened Italian mercenaries, men who had survived countless battles and no longer cared about politics. They wanted only one thing: money. Leading this dangerous army was Charles de Bourbon, once one of France's greatest noblemen. Years earlier, he had shocked Europe by abandoning the French king and joining Emperor Charles V. Now he commanded thousands of battle-hardened soldiers whose loyalty depended entirely on whether they could be rewarded. Bourbon understood that if he failed to satisfy his men, they might abandon him or even kill him. The emperor's treasury was nearly empty. No reinforcements arrived. No salaries came. Only silence. The army needed a target rich enough to satisfy thousands of desperate men. There was only one obvious choice: Rome. As the imperial army marched south, fear spread throughout Italy. Every town along the route closed its gates. Merchants hid their wealth. Farmers abandoned their homes. Nobles fled with whatever valuables they could carry. Rumors moved even faster than the soldiers themselves. They are coming. They have not been paid. They will take everything. By early May, those terrifying rumors reached Rome. Inside the Eternal City, panic slowly replaced confidence. The city's leaders understood that their defenses were weak. Rome still possessed the mighty Aurelian walls, massive stone fortifications that had protected the city for over 1,000 years. But walls alone could not win a battle. The defenders were far too few. Only a few thousand soldiers stood ready. Many were ordinary citizens with little military experience. Others were priests, volunteers, or local militia who had never faced a professional army. Weapons were limited. Armor was scarce. Even experienced soldiers struggled to equip themselves properly. Some reportedly sold their own equipment simply to survive during the months before the siege. Among the city's defenders stood the famous Swiss Guard. Small in number but legendary for their discipline, these elite soldiers had sworn to protect the Pope with their lives. Every guard understood that if the imperial army entered Rome, they would likely face impossible odds. Yet none considered abandoning their duty. Throughout the city, churches filled with worshippers. Families prayed for peace. Merchants hurried to hide gold beneath floors and inside walls. Precious artwork disappeared into secret rooms. Monasteries locked their gates. Every hour brought new reports that the imperial army was drawing closer. No one knew exactly when the attack would begin, only that it was coming. Outside Rome, thousands of imperial soldiers reached the hills overlooking the city. From the heights, they could see church domes shining beneath the spring sun. Some believed unimaginable riches waited behind those ancient walls. Others simply dreamed of finally receiving payment after months of hardship. Few imagined how much blood would soon cover those streets. That evening, campfires stretched across the countryside like glowing stars. The soldiers sharpened swords. Arquebusiers cleaned their firearms. Officers quietly discussed. The day the walls fell, May 6th, 1527, around 4 a.m. The city of Rome was still wrapped in darkness. A cold mist drifted across the fields outside the ancient walls, making it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. The silence that had settled over the Eternal City during the night was suddenly broken by the distant sound of drums, shouted commands, and thousands of marching feet. The attack had begun. Behind the thick fog, the Imperial army moved into position. Spanish veterans, German Landsknechts, and Italian mercenaries advanced pressed toward Rome's ancient walls, carrying ladders, ropes, axes, and scaling equipment. Their orders were simple: break into the city. Once inside, there would be no turning back. The defenders reacted immediately. Church bells rang across Rome, warning citizens that the enemy had arrived. Soldiers rushed to their assigned positions while frightened families hid inside churches, monasteries, and their own homes. Archers climbed onto the walls. Arquebusiers prepared their weapons. Artillery crews waited for the order to fire, but the heavy morning fog hid much of the attacking force, making accurate fire almost impossible. The first wave of Imperial soldiers rushed toward the walls. Ladders slammed against the ancient stone as defenders pushed them away with long poles and pikes. Boiling water, stones, arrows, and gunfire rained down from above. For a brief moment, it seemed the defenders might actually stop the assault. Several attackers fell before ever reaching the top of the walls. The ground outside Rome quickly became covered with the wounded and the dead, but the Imperial commanders refused to retreat. Whenever one assault failed, another began almost immediately. Fresh soldiers replaced exhausted ones. Wave after wave crashed against the city's defenses. The defenders, however, had no replacements. Every hour left them weaker. Every casualty reduced their already small numbers. Among the attackers rode their commander, Charles de Bourbon. Unlike many generals who directed battles from a safe distance, Bourbon moved close to the front lines, encouraging his men and helping organize the assault himself. His white cloak made him easy to recognize even through the morning mist. It was a dangerous mistake. From the walls, a defender spotted the famous commander. A single shot rang out. Moments later, Bourbon fell to the ground, mortally wounded. For an instant, confusion spread through the Imperial army. Some soldiers believed their leader's death might end the attack. Instead, the opposite happened. Enraged by the loss of their commander, thousands of soldiers launched an even more determined assault. Their desire for revenge mixed with months of frustration and unpaid wages. Now nothing could stop them. The fighting became desperate. The defenders had been standing on the walls for hours without rest. Many had exhausted their ammunition. Others fought hand-to-hand using swords, spears, and even stones. Smoke from gunpowder filled the air. The screams of wounded men echoed through the streets behind the walls. Despite their courage, the defenders were simply too few. Around sunrise, the impossible happened. At one section of the wall, repeated attacks finally weakened the defenses. Imperial soldiers forced their way over the battlements. Within minutes, more attackers poured through the opening. The breach widened rapidly. Roman defenders tried desperately to contain the breakthrough, but the flood of enemy soldiers became impossible to stop. The walls that had protected Rome for centuries had finally been broken. Panic spread through the city. Some units attempted an organized retreat. Others simply fled. Commanders shouted for their men to regroup, but the noise of battle drowned out their orders. Citizens watched in horror as imperial banners appeared above the city walls. The enemy had entered Rome. Inside the Vatican, Pope Clement VII was informed that the city's defenses were collapsing. The news came faster than anyone expected. Only hours earlier, there had still been hope that Rome might survive. Now the battle was already being lost. The Pope realized there was little time left. If captured, both the papacy and the future of the church would be in grave danger. As imperial troops poured into the streets, disciplined groups of defenders fought desperate delaying actions. They knew they could no longer save the city. Their only objective was to buy time. Time for civilians to escape. Time for the Pope to reach safety. Time for history to take one final turn. Smoke began rising above the rooftops. The sound of breaking doors echoed through nearby neighborhoods. Terrified citizens barricaded themselves inside their homes, while others ran toward the Vatican, hoping its walls would protect them. Some carried children, others carried only whatever. The last stand of the Swiss Guard. Morning, May 6th, 1527. The battle for Rome was over. Now, the massacre was about to begin. As imperial soldiers flooded deeper into the city, smoke rose from burning buildings and terrified screams echoed through narrow streets. Families ran in every direction searching for safety, but there was almost nowhere left to hide. The eternal city had fallen. Only one obstacle remained between the invading army and the head of the Catholic Church, the Swiss Guard. Near St. Peter's Basilica, fewer than 200 Swiss guards assembled in formation. Their colorful uniforms stood in sharp contrast to the smoke and blood that surrounded them. These men were not the largest army in Europe. They were not the best equipped, but they had taken an oath that could not be broken. They had sworn to protect the Pope, even if it cost them their lives. On this day, they intended to keep that promise. Captain Caspar Royst looked across the square. He knew the odds. Thousands of experienced imperial soldiers were advancing toward them, while his own force numbered only a few hundred exhausted men. Victory was impossible, but buying time was still possible. That was enough. The order was given. The Swiss Guard lowered their pikes and prepared for battle. The first wave of attackers rushed forward. Steel crashed against steel. Gunfire echoed through the square. Pikes splintered. Swords flashed through the smoke. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the Swiss guards fought with incredible discipline. Each step backward was carefully planned. Every minute they survived gave the Pope another minute to escape. Inside the Vatican, Pope Clement VII was being hurried through secret corridors by loyal officials and guards. There was only one route that offered any hope: a narrow, elevated passage known as the Passetto di Borgo, a fortified walkway connecting the Vatican to Castel Sant'Angelo. Built years earlier as an emergency escape route, it had never faced a test like this. Now it carried the future of the papacy itself. As the Pope moved through the hidden passage, the sounds of battle grew louder behind him. Outside, the Swiss guard continued fighting. One by one, they fell. Still, they refused to surrender. Many fought until they could no longer stand. Others continued defending wounded comrades despite knowing rescue would never come. Their sacrifice delayed the Imperial advance just long enough. Captain Royst was seriously wounded during the fighting. Friends carried him away from the battlefield, hoping he might survive. But the invading soldiers soon reached his home. According to historical accounts, they found the wounded captain there and killed him in front of his family. His courage had ended, his duty had not. Back in St. Peter's Square, the battle was almost finished. Bodies covered the ground. Broken weapons lay scattered among the fallen. Of the nearly 200 Swiss guards who had stood their ground that morning, only a small number survived. Most had died defending a single man. Their sacrifice would become one of the greatest acts of loyalty in military history. Even today, new members of the Swiss Guard remember this battle when they take their oath. Meanwhile, Pope Clement VII finally reached the safety of Castel Sant'Angelo. The great fortress stood across the Tiber River with thick stone walls capable of resisting even a determined siege. The drawbridge was raised. The gates were sealed. Thousands of frightened civilians managed to enter before the fortress closed. Countless others arrived too late. Desperate people threw themselves into the river, hoping to swim across. Some reached safety. Many disappeared beneath the water. With the Pope beyond their reach, the Imperial army unleashed its anger upon the city itself. Homes were forced open, churches were stripped of their treasures, palaces were searched room by room. Gold, silver, jewels, paintings, and anything of value changed hands within minutes. For many soldiers, this was the payment they believed they had been denied for months. Discipline disappeared, greed took control. The city that had inspired artists, scholars, and pilgrims across Europe was transformed into a place of fear. Smoke darkened the sky. Church bells no longer called people to prayer. Instead, they rang through a city struggling to survive one of the darkest days in its history. Yet the worst was still to come. What began as a military victory would soon become weeks of looting, destruction, disease, and unimaginable suffering that would leave Rome permanently changed. A city consumed by chaos. May 7th, 1527. By sunrise, Rome no longer resembled the magnificent capital of the Renaissance. The smoke of burning buildings drifted across the skyline, while the streets that had once welcomed pilgrims from every corner of Europe were now filled with frightened civilians, abandoned belongings, and armed soldiers searching for more treasure. The battle had ended, but the nightmare had only begun. With organized resistance almost completely destroyed, Imperial troops spread throughout the city. Without commanders able to control every unit, discipline quickly disappeared. Groups of soldiers entered homes one after another, breaking down doors with axes and forcing terrified families into the streets. Those believed to possess wealth were immediately questioned. If they denied having money, the soldiers searched every room, every cellar, and every hidden compartment. Walls were broken apart, floors were torn up, furniture was smashed open. Many Romans had hidden their gold beneath stone tiles or inside secret chambers, but experienced soldiers knew exactly where to look. The grand palaces of Rome became prime targets. Powerful nobles who had spent decades collecting priceless paintings, sculptures, rare books, and precious jewelry watched helplessly as their life's work disappeared in a single day. Some attempted to save themselves by offering large sums of money. Others surrendered family treasures without resistance. Yet promises of protection often meant nothing. Many buildings were looted even after their owners had paid enormous ransoms. Fear spread from one neighborhood to another. No one knew who would be next. The city's churches were not spared. Magnificent chapels that had stood untouched for generations were forced open. Golden candlesticks, silver crosses, sacred vessels, embroidered robes, and valuable ornaments vanished into soldiers' wagons. Some invaders believed these riches were simply another form of payment for their unpaid service. Others were driven only by greed. Centuries of religious treasures disappeared within hours. For ordinary citizens, survival became the only priority. Families abandoned their homes and hid inside abandoned buildings, underground storage rooms, or among the ruins left by the fighting. Parents struggled to keep children quiet. Even the smallest sound could reveal a hiding place. Every knock on a door brought new terror. No one knew whether it would be a neighbor or another group of armed soldiers. As the days passed, the city's food supply began to collapse. Markets remained closed. Bakeries stood empty. Many merchants had either fled or lost everything they owned. Fresh water became difficult to obtain in some districts, while thousands of frightened people searched desperately for bread and shelter. Disease soon followed. The bodies of soldiers, civilians, and animals lay unburied in many streets. The warm spring weather only made conditions worse. The once beautiful city slowly became overwhelmed by hunger, sickness, and the smell of death. Inside Castel Sant'Angelo, Pope Clement VII remained trapped. Although the fortress protected him from immediate capture, it also became a prison. Food supplies were limited. Communication with the outside world grew increasingly difficult. From the fortress walls, the Pope could see smoke rising across the city he had sworn to protect. Each day brought reports of more destruction, yet there was little he could do. Outside the fortress, many Romans continued hoping that allied armies would arrive and drive the invaders away. Messengers carried desperate requests for help across Italy. Several rulers discussed sending military assistance, but precious time slipped away. Every day that passed strengthened the imperial army's grip on Rome. For the people trapped inside the city, hope slowly faded. Among the invaders, another danger was growing. The enormous quantity of treasure created arguments between different groups of soldiers. Spanish veterans, German landsknechts, and Italian mercenaries often disputed how the spoils should be divided. Small fights occasionally broke out between men who only days earlier had fought side by side. Greed threatened to divide the victors themselves. Yet despite these tensions, the looting continued. Rome had survived invasions before. It had risen after disasters that many believed would destroy it forever. But this catastrophe felt different. The artistic center of the Renaissance, the spiritual heart of Western Christianity, one of Europe's greatest cities, now stood broken, exhausted, and almost unrecognizable. Still, the final chapter had not yet been written. The Pope remained inside Castel Sant'Angelo. The imperial commanders still demanded concessions, and the future of both Rome and the papacy would soon depend on a single negotiation. The fall of a great city. Late May to June 7, 1527. Weeks had passed since the walls of Rome were breached. The city that had once dazzled Europe with its wealth, culture, and faith had become almost unrecognizable. Many streets stood deserted, churches were silent, markets remained empty. The sounds that once filled the eternal city had been replaced by the cries of the hungry, the sick, and the grieving. For thousands of Romans, each new day was simply another struggle to stay alive. Inside Castel Sant'Angelo, Pope Clement VII remained surrounded by imperial forces. Although the fortress had protected him from capture, it could not protect him forever. Food supplies were running low. Clean water became increasingly scarce. Disease threatened everyone inside the fortress. The Pope continued hoping that an allied army would arrive to lift the siege. Messengers carried desperate pleas across Italy, but no rescue came. The League of Cognac, formed to resist Emperor Charles V, was unable to save Rome. The city stood alone. Outside the fortress, imperial commanders slowly restored order among their exhausted soldiers. The uncontrolled violence of the first days gradually decreased. Instead of fighting in the streets, attention turned toward negotiations. The emperor's representatives wanted more than victory. They wanted complete political control. The Pope, with few remaining options, realized he could no longer continue resisting. Every additional day only brought more suffering to the people of Rome. Finally, after weeks of siege, negotiations reached their conclusion. On June 7, 1527, Pope Clement VII agreed to surrender. To secure his freedom, he accepted harsh conditions, including the payment of an enormous ransom and the surrender of several important fortresses. It was not a victory, it was a painful necessity. The leader of the Catholic Church had been forced to negotiate while trapped inside his own fortress. When the gates finally opened, the devastation became impossible to ignore. Entire neighborhoods had been stripped of their wealth. Many homes stood abandoned. Magnificent palaces had been emptied. Libraries containing priceless manuscripts had been damaged or destroyed. Paintings, sculptures, jewels, and sacred treasures had vanished forever. Some priceless works of history disappeared without anyone ever knowing where they went. The cultural loss was beyond calculation. The human cost was even greater. Thousands of civilians had lost their lives. Many more were left homeless. Families had been separated. Children had become orphans. Disease and starvation continued claiming victims long after the fighting had ended. For the survivors, the memory of those terrible weeks would never fade. News of Rome's destruction spread rapidly across Europe. Kings, princes, ambassadors, and religious leaders struggled to believe the reports. How could the center of Christianity, the home of the Pope, the greatest city of the Renaissance, have fallen so completely? The sack of Rome shocked the entire continent. It marked the symbolic end of the Italian Renaissance's golden age and dramatically changed the balance of power in Europe. No ruler could ignore what had happened. Ironically, Emperor Charles V had never publicly ordered the destruction that unfolded inside Rome. His unpaid army had acted with a mixture of anger, desperation, revenge, and greed. Although the emperor later expressed sorrow over the disaster, history would forever connect his reign with one of Europe's darkest military catastrophes. The damage could never truly be undone. Yet from tragedy came one extraordinary legacy. The sacrifice of the Swiss Guard became a lasting symbol of loyalty and courage. Nearly all of those soldiers gave their lives so that Pope Clement VII could escape through the Passetto di Borgo. Even today, every new member of the Swiss Guard remembers that sacrifice. Their oath is a reminder that duty sometimes demands the ultimate price. Rome itself eventually recovered. New churches were built, palaces were restored, artists returned, pilgrims once again filled its streets, but the city was never quite the same. The scars of 1527 remained visible for generations, not only in damaged buildings but also in the hearts of those who survived. History remembers countless battles. Some changed borders, others changed kings, but only a few changed the course of civilization itself. The sack of Rome was one of those moments. It reminded the world that even the greatest cities can fall, that wealth cannot always buy safety, and that when power, ambition, and desperation collide, the consequences can echo through history for centuries. The end.